Welcome to How Preschool Teachers Do It.
This is Alison Kentos. I am an early childhood educator.
And this is Cindy Tarabush. I am an early childhood consultant.
This podcast is for parents and early childhood professionals.
Let our experience and research-based knowledge become your guide. Welcome back, preschool peeps.
Hi, peeps.
In our last episode, we talked about the body budget and how that adds energy and stress to our systems if it's out of whack, and how that kind of looks in children's behavior. And today we're going to add something else that can cause some behaviors and it does put our body budget out of balance. And it's often misunderstood. So we're here today to clear up a whole other thing, but also to add a monkey wrench into what we said last time, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Very often when young children bounce from one thing to another, exhibit a lot of energy, they can't seem to stay on track. We'll hear adults say to each other, "Oh, I bet that child has ADHD. I know it when I see it. The child will be diagnosed eventually. I'll bet you that's ADHD," which, as we learned in the last episode, could just be extra cortisol in the bloodstream because of something being out of balance in their body budget. Go back and listen to that. So sometimes that causes the bouncing around and the extra energy. But also, to throw another possibility into the mix, it may someday, not yet, because they're so young and their brains are still developing some of the areas that would show us if there was potentially ADHD. So not yet. Eventually they may be diagnosed with that. But we often see the same behaviors when it's actually simply anxiety, which, when I think about it, makes perfect sense. Last week, I had an anxiety-provoking week. Very anxiety-provoking week. And I can see now, thinking about it in retrospect, how someone might think that my behavior was like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. My thoughts were bouncing here, there, and everywhere. And my husband, I would tell him what happened with this stressful event in my life when he came home from work. He would start talking to me about what was going on with him. I'm going back to talking about that stressful event because that's what's causing me the anxiety. Then he moves me on to a different topic. And all of a sudden I remember something I forgot to do because of all the anxiety. So I was very anxious, and I know that I was bouncing everywhere. I know it. I can see how people would look at me and say, a little bit of undiagnosed ADHD there. But that was not the case. It was the anxiety level.
Yes. Like when you sent me the article about this, I was like, it was like a light bulb went off in my head. It was like, bing. I'm like, this is my whole life. I was like, because when you're in an anxious state, like you're saying, like your thoughts they're not like linked. I feel like you are bouncing all over the place. Your feelings and your thoughts are not rational. You know what I mean? Like you're all over the place because you're in this state, because you're anxious. Like it's not. And like I've definitely had anxiety attacks or a high anxiety in my life where I definitely move around a lot more. I'm bouncing around, just physically bouncing around. Like I need to move around because if I sit still, like that's not going to work. And so I think people have said to me, like, Alison, are you sure you don't have adult onset ADHD? Somebody has said that to me, and it's no. And there was a point where I was like, maybe I do, but no, I have anxiety. I have a lot of anxiety, and like, I think I think that anxiety and ADHD have very similar symptoms or traits, like when you're anxious, you are bouncing around. Sometimes people with anxiety, those are the people that are like tapping their foot constantly or like moving or twirling their hair or like, they just can't stop moving, and I think like there's children out there that are anxious that are being diagnosed with ADHD. That's probably not. It's probably a lot of anxiety.
It is, though. It's a two-way street. So
yeah.
Sometimes it's sometimes it can be that the child just is more anxious. And especially in young children, they can't express that to us all the time. They can't always, not all young children can come to us and say, I'm feeling anxious. They don't have the capacity to do that yet, right? They don't know how to even seek the help they need with that. So it can be a few things. It can be it's not ADHD at all. It is a high level of anxiety. But it can go the other way. It can be this child is having trouble attending to tasks, potentially could eventually be diagnosed with ADHD. And because they're having so much trouble attending to tasks, that causes anxiety.
Yes.
Suffice it to say, there tends to be a link between anxiety and how it manifests, attention deficit disorder and how it manifests, and how one causes the other's symptoms. It sort of goes back.
I think that these go hand in hand, kind of thing, right? Like you're gonna, if you have one, you're most likely gonna have the other kind of thing. You know, I think, but like I feel like there's so many children being diagnosed with ADHD at a very, very high rate, and maybe it needs to be looked at that. Maybe this isn't ADHD that they are diagnosed with. I mean, they get diagnosed, but maybe that's not the proper diagnosis, right? You're getting diagnosed with this and then you put on medicine for it. And what if it's not that? What if it's something else?
Or what if it's both? What if it's both? What if
that's true.
The anxiety needs to be,
it needs to be addressed too.
I can totally see when I think of children. Yeah, but when, again, the children that we work with are too young to be diagnosed with ADHD.
Yes.
And whether the ADHD is causing anxiety or it's just anxiety by itself, I get back to, we need to work with children about anxiety. We need to try and reduce, either way, it doesn't matter, I think, now that I say that out loud. I don't think it matters if the child will be eventually diagnosed with this or not. I think what matters to me as an early educator is ensuring that I work with children to teach them how to manage anxiety and how thinking about how I can reduce the anxiety level in my interactions with children, in my environment, in teaching them to interact with each other. Perhaps the overriding goal for us is actually focus on reducing anxiety. And that's the best we can do for some children who may eventually be diagnosed. And it's also the best we can do for children if that's what's causing them to bounce from one thing to another, the anxiety level they have. Whenever I talk about anxiety, I'm reminded of one student that I once had who was a very highly anxious child. And everything scared her, everything frightened her. And we used to work with her often, teaching her how to deep breathe so that she could try and keep her body calm.
Yeah.
And that was years ago. I just sort of wonder how she is today. That was the moral.
No, but I was just going to say before you mentioned that student was that if we can teach the children at this age, this young age that we work with, these coping skills, how to calm your body down when you're anxious, how to maybe change the thought process, how to cope with this anxiety. What a gift that is, because then as they get older, they're like, oh, I remember learning this when I was young. And I know how to deal with this better now. I have the tools in my toolbox to help myself get maybe out of this anxious state a little bit, and I think for a long time, like when I was a kid, I don't even think they talked about this kind of stuff. They never taught us how to deal with anxiety or social emotional issues ever. No. It wasn't even a thing. They were just like, deal with it kind of thing.
Deal with it. Yep. Get over it.
Deal with it.
Get over it. You'll be fine.
And so like we did not grow up with the tools in our toolbox on how to help ourselves, whereas we can give them that gift early on, I think, which is a nice little blessing in a way, because we didn't get that, and look at us. We have a lot of anxiety.
When you think about it, it's sort of generationally sad because we weren't taught how to deal with anxiety because our parents didn't know how to teach us how to deal with anxiety because they weren't taught, because it was generations of people looking at children and saying, you'll be fine, get over it. But that's not the case. Children have to know how to manage the reactions in their bodies, to bring their bodies into balance. And they also need to know that being anxious or fearful, that's a normal human emotion. Very often, don't you think as adults we beat ourselves up over it? I beat myself up over it. I'll be anxious and I'll be like, why am I behaving this way? I shouldn't be nervous about this. I shouldn't be. When actually, if you're anxious, it's exactly how you should feel. It's how you feel. And instead, we need to learn to manage it. And if we help children, even if they're eventually diagnosed with ADHD, perhaps the anxiety that that condition can provoke in young children who are having trouble complying with the expectations of our very, regimented educational system as they get older. Although there are more parameters for children today than there were in the past, there's still a certain factory style system to education that flies in the face of these children who have, other challenges or other ways of thinking or being or are neurodivergent in some way. So, maybe if they're very young, even if they're eventually going to be diagnosed, we work with them about anxiety. That's it. Let's all work on anxiety. Then at least we've given them the tools to help them cope with whatever happens if they're eventually diagnosed, because diagnosis isn't the end of anything. Diagnosis is the beginning of everything. It's the beginning of people learning about themselves and how to cope with who they are. We also in early education act like that diagnosis of ADHD is the solution. No, this is a lifelong pursuit for these people. It's not the solution. The solution is going to be, how do I manage? Part of that managing is going to be coping with the anxiety that it provokes. So let's all stop looking at children and just going, ADHD, I'm sure that child's going to be diagnosed, and think about the things that are within our control, like, how do I help this child cope with anxiety? How do I reduce the anxiety level in this room? How do I get the children to treat each other kindly and generously so that they're not causing each other more anxiety? Right. Maybe that's what our focus needs to be.
Yes, I agree. I think that should be the focus, right?
Yeah. Instead of looking at each other going, ADHD, smiling and nodding, that's not solving anything.
Well, that's not solving anything. And I know a lot of teachers who do that. They're like, oh, yep, they're going to be diagnosed one day. It's like, okay, yeah, so they're going to be diagnosed.
You don't know that.
You don't. First off, you don't know that. They're 3. A lot of times people say that to me. I'm like, yeah, he's acting like a 3-year-old. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think of it, because they're way too young for that to be a diagnosis. But even if they do eventually get diagnosed with that, what does that have anything to do with what you're doing with that child right now? Nothing. Okay, you need to help these students, whether they're going to be diagnosed with God knows what, anything, like multiple of things they're going to be diagnosed with at 10 years old, 12 years old, 30 years old. What are you doing now to help them? Right now. They're in your room now. What are you doing now?
I don't know. But when people start to say things like, could be ADHD, I look forward now to look at them and saying, could be anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are we going to do about that? Because I think the first thing we need to do is reduce the anxiety level in this environment in some way, and help this child cope with the fact that they may be anxious, maybe a more anxious human being, which some people are. It's all a continuum, right? Some of us tend to get more anxious than others. Some of us go through periods of time when we're more anxious, and some people are just anxious all the time. So it is like a range of how anxious a human being might be and how they may react. But regardless, we all need the tools to deal with it. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to be like telling teachers when they say, what do you think? ADHD? I'm going to say, I don't know. Could be anxiety. I hope you will all do that when people say that to your preschool peeps, that you'll go back and go, I don't know. Could be anxiety. And put that in the mix of the conversation among the professionals. And if you're working with families and there's a concern, they need to know children at this age aren't generally diagnosed with that sort of thing, with ADHD. Right. That said, we can definitely work with your child having to do with dealing with their emotions and anxiety, and see if that helps a little bit, because diagnosis or not in the future, Anxiety and ADHD have many of the same manifestations. People will jump from one thing to another, have trouble concentrating on what they're doing. The manifestation of it is the same. I hope you all, preschool peeps, I hope you all think of a time when you were super anxious and what that must have looked like to the outside world, right? Come out of your own head and think about, what do I look like here?
Right.
And then
Well,
I
yeah,
think
because
of I think
that's
of
what I
adults I
thought of when I
know,
read this article. I was like, oh
right?
oh
What do
my,
I
this makes
look
so much
like? And
sense. Yeah.
yeah, I thought about last week. And I also think about adults who I know are very anxious adults, and maybe they were diagnosed with some sort of anxiety disorder. They go from here, there, and everywhere. Their thoughts tend to sort of flit around. So assume nothing. We should never be assuming anything. We are not qualified to diagnose anything. And helping children with anxiety helps everybody. We
Yeah.
all have periods of anxiety in our lives.
Yeah.
Don't single out these children either. The whole class, everybody
Everyone.
needs help
Yeah.
with their anxiety. Goodness knows we're living in a highly anxious world right now,
Yes.
with a lot of disparity between groups and pressure and things you may or may not agree with, and people can't seem to get along. Anything having to do with anxiety is going to be helpful to the whole group.
Yeah. Yeah, because I feel like as a human being, there's going to be, no matter what you are diagnosed with or not diagnosed with, you are going to have a
Yep.
period of anxiety. You know, things are going to
Yeah.
come up and it's going to cause you anxiety. The degree of that anxiety is going to be different for everybody, but everybody's going to get some sort of period of time where they are anxious about something. It's normal, it is natural. So why not give the coping skills to deal with it? Because we're all going to go through it. Everybody goes through it, no matter what. So teach the children that, and then they'll know what to do when that comes up in their lives.
Even more than that, the next time someone looks at you and says ADHD, look at them and go, oh no, could be anxiety. They manifest the same way. I hope
Yeah.
that preschool peeps, I hope this gives you so much food for thought about our thoughts about what could be going on with the children and the assumptions that we make.
Yeah, that's true.
Never assume.
Yeah.
Never ever assume, especially about children's behavior or about what families are doing or what's going on at home and how people, no assumptions. Just let's try and help the children as best we can. And often this is the best way we can.
Yeah.
All righty, preschool peeps. Lots of food for thought last week and this week. I hope you'll take it back and really reflect on it. And we will catch you next time on the podcast.
Bye, peeps.